In the previous lesson, we've looked at several ways of holding values within JavaScript and then using those values within your code to create amazing things with that code. So in this lesson, we want to look at another way of storing values, and that's going to be objects. And what objects do is they allow you to store multiple values similar to arrays, but they're going to use named values instead of as within arrays where we're using just that one variable and we were accessing all the different items within the array via the variable. So now we've got an option to use named values. Let's open up our editor and start adding in some objects in JavaScript. So we've just got a plain JavaScript file or an HTML file that we've got some JavaScript in it, and we're going to start creating some objects. The first thing, it's going to look very familiar. So the same as when we set up the array, we're just going to create a variable called myObject, and we're going to define it as a new object. And this is going to create an object wrapper where we're going to be able to contain content into the myObject variable. And again, it's going to hold multiple values. So we have a number of different ways that we can construct objects. And this is just a very basic rudimentary way to construct objects. And as mentioned before, objects give us the ability to hold multiple pieces of information via a named process. So if we want to have an object and maybe we've got a user, so we've got a first name for that user. And also for my object, maybe we've got a company. So I'm going to give it a company name there. And then maybe lastly for my object, so maybe we have something like age or something like that. And then I'm going to go back into our trusted console and console log out this object with all the information that's contained within there. And we'll take a look and we'll see what this looks like within our browser. So when I refresh this, we see that we've got our object, we've got a first name Lawrence, company, discovery VIP, and age 33. So this is the contents of this object. That was one way, similar to arrays, where we could populate that object, we could create the object, initialize it. So we initialize an empty object called myObject, and then we fill that with some data. So we also have other ways to create objects. So I'm going to create another object, and maybe I'll just do this one as myObject A. And for this one, we're going to format it similar to what the output in the console was going to be. So we have the ability to create an object with these paired values. And the way that paired values work is we've got a name to identify it within the object, and we also have a value attached to that name. Let's construct something similar to what we did earlier, and we'll do something like name, and this time we'll give it some other values and comma separate them out. So it's similar to what we did with the arrays, but of course slightly different in an object type format here. So now we've got a company, and I'm going to assign a value to that company. So maybe something like test. And then also maybe age, and we'll put a value for age there. And so now we can console log out that myObject A, and we'll take a look and we'll see what this looks like. So initially, do you think that this is going to work? It's output the same way that we're outputting the object initially, that we see it output within the console log. So what do you think is going to happen here? So when I refresh it, we see that we got this error here. The reason I'm getting the error is because when you're defining objects, you're not actually using an equal sign. As you would normally, you use this colon. So I need to update these and change this to a colon format, because we're not doing that assigned value to there. We're just assigning it via the colon. So now when I go out and if I refresh it, we see that we get the exact same results. It looks the same way within the console log, but remember that we do need to use, instead of an equal sign, we do need to use the colon. So just as it's displayed within the console, this is how we can output it and create an object within that same format. This is just a changed way of assigning a value, because previously we've been working with those equal signs, and we know that the equal sign equals the name and then the value is assigned to it. So this was another way that we can work and assign values into it, as opposed to with the equal signs right within the object. And as we can see, this is output within the same way. So what happens when I want to output, maybe I want to output just the first name from my object? So how do I do that? So we see that when we just do the object name, the name that's assigned to this variable, that when we output that, we get all the information from the object. But we also have a way to isolate out that information, so to see some specific content within that object. And so I'm going to use object, the first one that we've created, and maybe I want to look at and pick out the first name. So there's actually several different ways that you can do this within JavaScript. And the first one is going to be just calling over to the named item. So similar to what we did within arrays, where we identify that, where we would have originally identified the index, but now we're identifying via the name in the objects. And that's how the code is able to translate and understand what part of the object we want to pull back. So the other way to access information from the object, so you might see it written, and there are different cases for using each one of these. So sometimes you may want to make it more dynamic. So there are different case scenarios for using the different ways of calling the object. So we can also separate it by a period, and then we can output that first name within this type of format as well. And then this is, some people will prefer to use this type of presentation in order to output that content, because it's a lot cleaner. But on the other hand, this way is more functional and it's more dynamic. And we see that this is the same way as we've been assigning the values. And of course, we could just take that same format here. We have that bracketed format, and we can assign values into the object that way. So both ways will work, and depending on the scenario that you're using. So here we're able to pull out the first name of the object that we've created. And if you are familiar with other programming languages, you might be looking at this and saying, okay, well, this doesn't really work the same way as objects do in object-oriented programming languages that I've seen before. Usually we have to set up a constructor, and that's how we create the objects in JavaScript or within the scripting code. So you can do the same type of format in JavaScript, and I'm going to show you how in the next lesson.